Hello everyone, welcome to the Geoecolologist. I am Dr. Krishnanand and you have been watching my videos on physical geography as well as evolution of geographical thought. In today's session on physical geography, that is process geomorphology, we are going to talk about the denudational processes part 1. So we are going to learn about various kinds of denudational process in which weathering is one of the most important type. So let's go ahead and learn further. But before we go ahead, please like and subscribe to our channel and please share the videos with others as well. So, in the first part of this process geomorphology, that is denudational processes number 1, which is part of the geomorphology that we are studying in physical geography. So, we are going to learn about various denudational processes, of which weathering that you see here is going to be the first topic in this session. So let's understand what is denudational processes, and then we further go ahead and understand about what is weathering and its characteristics. So first thing is that what are the denudational processes? So denudational processes occur at or near, remember these two words, at or near the Earth's surface. So if suppose this is the Earth's surface, then it is happening just near the surface. So that is what is important here, and that is what we study in the geography and especially in physical geography, where it is geomorphology, because we are looking at this particular shape of the surface of the Earth. So that is important here. Then they influence the surface and subsurface topography. So here the second word comes in is topography. So in geography, what we do, the entire Earth and its description. But in topography, it is mostly about the land surface, because topo basically means land. So we are talking about these processes that shape the surface of the Earth, that is land surface of the Earth. So that is where topography is important, and they are key to the evolution and development of various landforms that we study in geomorphology. That's why denudational processes are important. The next important thing is that this is the first part. So what are the various parts of these denudational processes or the various types? So let's learn first. So first part is the weathering that we are going to discuss in detail. Then second is erosion. Third is mass wasting, and fourth is deposition, which also includes transportation, right? So transportation plus deposition. So these are the four basic types of these denudational processes in geomorphology, that is part of physical geography that we study. So today let's understand weathering in details, but just for the concept, understand what is the difference or what is the similarity between all of them and how they are linked together. So weathering is basically what? It is physical disintegration of basically what? Rocks. So physical disintegration or chemical alteration. So suppose if this is a rock and it has disintegrated into various smaller parts, right? This is what is weathering basically. So what do you see? A rock's position is not changed. It is at the same place, but it is disintegrated. It is broken into fragments, into pieces, because of the physical actions or maybe of chemical actions. So that is what weathering is, simply understood. Then erosion is the second thing. So what is this erosion? Erosion is basically the removal, the physical removal and transportation of weathered material. So now when this disintegration has happened, this material is now being removed by various agents like wind, water, ice or gravity. So when this is removed from its original position, suppose original position was A and now it is being removed to position B. So this is what is erosion. So if a place changes from A to B, then it is erosion. But if simply it withers or simply it disintegrates, then it is weathering. So that is the significant difference between weathering and erosion. And then third one what we have is mass wasting. So the transfer or movement of rock or soil. So again there is a transfer or transportation involved in mass wasting as well. But then what is the difference between erosion and mass wasting then? It is basically talking about the impact of slope gradient, basically the influence of gravity. That is where it is important. So in erosion, maybe wind, water, ice or gravity, all of the processes can favor this removal of the material from one place to the other. But when we say mass wasting, we are very specific that the movement or removal of this material is only under influence of gravity, because rest of them are just agents that facilitate the process, but the major influencer is gravity. So that is the basic difference between erosion and mass wasting. So you have to remember the word gravity related to mass wasting. And you remember gravity, it means it is function of slope. So along the slope, if there is a movement of material, because the slope gradient is important, so angle of slope is important, the gradient of slope is important here in mass wasting. Then further, the last part, which is transportation and further deposition. So what happens? The material which has been now physically disintegrated in the first process, it has been transported by various agents like water, wind, ice, and also on the influence of slope. What happens? Ultimately, from one place, from A to B, this material has now been transported, and at B it is now deposited. So this is the fourth part of denudational process, which is called deposition. So the process by which these weathered and eroded materials, remember weathering and erosion, all these materials are now deposited to a new location. So that is what we understand as deposition. So we are going to do what? We are going to understand each one of them in different session. So in today's session, we are going to focus only on the concept of weathering and its various important features, characteristics. So let's learn weathering in today's session, and in sessions to come, we are going to learn about erosion, mass wasting, and deposition in separate lectures. So let's go ahead. Now, the first question that arises here is, why are denudational processes important? So remember, first thing that we see here is that they help to regulate what we understand as rock cycle. So remember, you must have understood biogeochemical cycle. Remember the ecology concept. So when we say something is cyclic in nature, it means it starts from A and through different processes again goes back to A. So this is what cyclic nature means. So when we say rock cycle, it means rock changes from A to B to C, and this cyclic event keeps happening in the nature. So from A to B and B to C and then C to A again, rocks recycle. So keeps on cycling. It means various forms of rock like igneous, metamorphic, sedimentary keeps on changing their forms. So remember, denudational process is that important process which is there in this between A, B and C, what you see here. So that is what the facilitator is there, from one form to the other, the carrier, the facilitator. That's why denudational processes are important. Then the transformation of solid rock into sediments and soil. This is what they regulate. So bigger rock materials are now broken into smaller fragments, and they are further now converted into soil particles. So that is what is important here, soil formation. Then the redeposition of this material forms the newer sedimentary rocks. Then what happens? We understand how the layers of sediments are deposited, as we have understood through geosynclinal theories, through other plate tectonic theories, through young fold mountain formation, as we know. So what we understood, that these smaller sediments are deposited in various layers, as we know, and then when they are in different layers and they are frozen together with time, they are known as sedimentary rocks. So what happens? The entire regulation of this rock cycle, the soil formation, the various types of rock formation, these are related to all these denudational processes, and these processes have been operating on the surface of the earth since the formation of earth, that is 4.6 billion years ago. So throughout the entire geological time scale of the earth, we can see that various kinds of formation and deformation of the supercontinents into different land masses, formation of sediments, formation of various geosynclines, formation of fold mountains. So several processes are there. And remember, one thing which is common to all of them is this process of denudation, which is weathering, erosion, mass wasting and deposition, along with the transportation of these materials. So that is why we are studying denudational process as an important process in the geomorphology. Now let's understand this phenomena in detail that we say is weathering. So as we know, the word is weathered material. So one major rock boulder is now broken into several pieces, and now it is broken into several fragments. But one thing that is important here, there is no change of location. Remember, so it is just there at the same location Alright, location is just same, but it is broken down gradually. So that is what we understand as simply the physical or chemical disintegration of the major rock particle. So let's understand in details now. So through this diagram, let's understand that what is weathering and how it helps in the maintenance of this rock cycle. So let's understand this rock cycle first. So what you see here is this continental crust, right? What happens to this? There is an agent like water, wind, ice, all these things. So what happens? It goes through weathering process. It means disintegration, and it converts to regolith, that is the broken fragments and particles. What happens then? It is further eroded and deposited into different layers of sediments. Then what is formed? Sedimentary rocks are formed, right? Then what happens? From sedimentary rocks, what we see is three paths, right? 1, 2, and 3. So first path is the tectonic uplift. So through this what happens? Then again there is a rise of the mountain. So as we know, tectonic upliftment leads to mountain formation. So all the entire Himalayan region, Alps, so all these young fold mountains out of the sedimentary rocks, that is one part. If this sedimentary rock is metamorphosed, so that is what is the metamorphism process. So metamorphic rocks are formed, right? And then they also can further get tectonically uplifted, or further it can lead to the magma formation when this is exposed to intense heating or pressure later on. So the third phase what we see is this melting phase. So if sedimentary rock or metamorphic rock, both can go through this magma formation, because we have studied the process of subduction, one layer going inside the other in the continental drift and plate tectonics theories. So we understand that this process keeps happening on the Earth's surface. So subduction keeps happening. So newer magma is converted from the older rock materials that may be of sedimentary nature or metamorphic nature. So the next kind of rock that we see is the igneous rock. Then what happens? Again, there is tectonic uplift. So mountain formation or horst and graben structure that we have already studied. So what is happening here? We can understand that through this entire cyclic event, from one form of the rock to the other form of the rock, this event is happening continuously on the Earth's surface as we see, right? But what is to be understood is that these denudational processes are important facilitators of this entire rock cycle. So what we study here is weathering, and just look at weathering here. It leads to this entire process further. So that is how weathering becomes the first step in the rock cycle. That is why it is very important to understand weathering and its characteristics. Now, the next thing that we need to understand is the factors affecting the weathering. So, what are the major factors? So, let's understand. The first factor that we see is the tectonic setting. It means plate tectonics, the tectonic movement of various plates on the surface of the earth that we have studied. So, what happens here? The young rising mountains, as we know, that is weathering happens there. So, what you see here in this image, these weathered rock fragments lying here, and these slopes, these surfaces, gradually by the impact of water or glacier, they have now weathered into different rock fragments, isn't it? So this is happening here, and what we know is as mechanical weathering, which is the most common type what you see here. That is why tectonic setting is important. That is first factor. Then rock composition is exactly more important, because remember what happens? The example what we see is that different minerals have different rate of this decomposition or disintegration. So if it is harder, it will take more time. It is resistant. So what will happen? It will not easily disintegrate. But it is softer. So what will happen? It will easily disintegrate. So for example here, calcite weathers quickly, all right, through dissolution, because calcite, calcium mineral, is soluble in water. So chemical reaction happens and dissolution happens. So it is weathered easily. But at the same time, if we look at quartz, so quartz is a resistant variety of mineral. It does not easily weather down. So it is very resistant. That's why it is important to understand this rock composition, that is the rock hardness, its resistivity. All these factors are important in terms of weathering as factors of weathering. Then what we understand further is the example of mafic rocks. Remember, mafic is basically magnesium and Fe, that is iron containing rocks. These are what the principle of ferromagnetism we understand. So ferromagnesian minerals they are known as. So because they have iron as well as magnesium component, and remember iron and magnesium are reactive to what? Oxygen. They form rust, so they corrode, corrosion happens, right? So they wither more easily in nature. That's why the rock composition is important in terms of its characteristics, like the resistivity, the dissolution factor, its mineral reacting to the air component like oxygen. So that is what is important in factor of weathering as rock composition. So the next factor in weathering of rocks is rock structure. So why is this structure important? Remember, in previous lectures we have talked about the structure of rocks related to folds and faults. Remember rock fracture, which had jointed rocks, fragmented rocks, and also faulting happening, movement happening. So what happens? Distribution of joints in the rock, that is the structural part of the rock. So distribution of these joints are one of the major influencers of weathering process. Now why? Because suppose if this rock fragment is highly jointed, it means there is these lines of weaknesses along which it can break away further. So these joints are those lines where weakness is there, so where the most probability of weathering down is there. That's why if rocks are heavily jointed, they are more prone to weathering. But if they are hard rock which are not that jointed, unjointed, so they will not weather that easily. That is the major important point when we talk about rock structure. So if you look at these mounds, the igneous mounds, these are unjointed rocks. Those weather very slowly because they have just surface erosion happening that breaks down. But remember, if there is a multi-layered rock structure like sedimentary rocks, it can weather from different segments because it has lots of joints. So that is what you have to remember in terms of rock structure. Then next factor in weathering is topography. As we know, the slope becomes important, the gravity is another factor. So if there is a steepness in the slope, obviously we understand that this particular surface is now having gravity influence, and under that influence, remember, it had a tendency on steeper slope to weather down easily, right? Moving down. So we understand this process as part of mass wasting that we are going to learn. But remember, this mass wasting is that process in which erosion happens due to gravity. So erosion is the basic process because there is a removal of material. But why is it part of mass wasting? Because slope is involved, because gravity is involved. So what happens? Due to topography, the gravity comes into the picture. So weathering occurs faster on steeper slopes. So that is how weathering, erosion and mass wasting are related. Although we understand them in different ways in as unique phenomena, but they are integrated when we come to this slope part, right? Because gravity is important factor in slope, so it part of mass wasting it becomes. Removal of material is part of erosional process, that's why it becomes part of erosion, and disintegration of rock is the first thing that happens, that is part of the weathering. So that is how it is important. So remember, steeper slopes weather more quickly. The next factor in weathering is the vegetation factor. Now why is vegetation important? Remember, vegetation has both these rules. Some places on slope where you have grass cover or vegetation, it holds the soil and it lowers down the possibility of weathering of this surface. But remember, at some places there are jointed rocks and these roots of these plants penetrate and further they develop and they create more jointed surfaces and losing of these rocks happen. So that is what is important, that sometimes weathering is actually fostered by vegetation and sometimes it is protected as well. So it has both the role. So remember, vegetation promotes weathering due to increased water retention. So through these roots, there is seepage of water here inside, and remember, water will again do what? It will again do some chemical reaction with these soluble rock minerals and further it will loosen up the soil. So what will happen? It will disintegrate gradually. So that is important. And if there is a removal of this vegetation, then obviously due to agents like water, glacier or anything, wind maybe, it can be removed again. So this is how vegetation impacts the weathering, and it maybe accelerate the rates of weathering and erosion as well, as you see in this particular diagram. The next important factor is the biological activity. So remember the chemical disintegration of rocks. So bacterial influence is important, as this bacterial activity leads to the chemical weathering. So remember, there is a disintegration of rocks because of this particular chemical reactions as well. That's why biological activity is another factor. Then further, we have the next factor that we already know, that is climate. It is one of the biggest influencers. And how? Let's understand. So chemical weathering is more prevalent. Now remember, this can be asked as a multiple choice question. So chemical weathering is function of what? Warm, wet tropical climates. So remember this warm and wet tropical climate. Now mechanical weathering is more prevalent in colder, relatively drier region. So these are the two statements related to the climate and weathering that we need to remember. So if it is warm and wet, what will happen more? Chemical weathering. But if it is cold and dry, then mechanical disintegration is more pronounced. So looking into this graph as well, this is temperature and this is rainfall. So remember, where maximum temperature is there and maximum rainfall is there, strong chemical weathering is there. So you can look into this graph, and gradually when we go away from this, we have moderate chemical weathering, and as we move towards the colder region, you have strong mechanical weathering. And further, what we see is very slight weathering, mainly by wind happening, as we see the area of lesser rainfall and higher temperatures. So what happens, that temperature and precipitation, remember this TP or PT? So TP factor is important. So if it is more rainy area where you have lots of temperature, so tropics is the region where majorly strong chemical reactions happen and chemical disintegration of rocks happen. But as we go away from tropics, there is more likelihood of mechanical weathering happening. So that is important here, the relationship of climate and weathering. So what have we learned? The summary of these factors affecting weathering. You can now remember tectonic setting, rock composition, rock structure, topography, vegetation, biological activity, and climate. So you have to remember this important thing, that factors affecting weathering. Many times it is asked in different examination questions. So if you want a shortcut, you can make it your way. So it is just TRR, then you have TV, and then you have BG. So if you can make some word out of it according to your convenience, you can do it. So through mnemonics you can understand. So TRR, TV, and BG. So it's tectonic setting, rock composition, rock structure, topography, vegetation, biological activity, and climate. So these are the major factors affecting the weathering process. Now, furthermore, let's understand its various types. So after we have understood the factors, the types are largely linked to the same factors. So first is called mechanical, that is physical weathering. So it is physical disintegration. So examples are, remember these names, exfoliation. So remember, exfoliation is removal of the outer layer of the rocks. That is what is called exfoliation. So it is foliated, outer surface is removed. Then what we have is the next one, that is frost wedging. So remember, in the areas where you have higher diurnal range of temperature, extremity. So what happens? There is freezing temperature at night and then extreme heat in the morning. So what happens? The rocks that go through this contraction and expansion, so there is this frost wedging happening. So what happens? Many times soil within these rocks tend to increase in volume because of the freezing. So remember, when it goes upward, so what happens? It creates this physical disintegration. Then you have similarly salt wedging because of the saltation process. Then temperature changes, abrasion, all these leads to this particular type of weathering we understand as mechanical physical weathering. Then second one is the chemical weathering. So remember, here chemical reaction is important. So decomposition, dissolution, alteration or weakening of the rock through chemical processes. So what are these processes called? Carbonation, hydration, hydrolysis, oxidation, solution. So in chemistry in school days you may have studied it, but if you have not studied it, just Google these terms simply. Carbon word is here, so it means reaction with carbon. Hydration is basically talking about reaction with water. Hydrolysis, the lysis word is basically breaking into different ions or pieces. So H plus OH minus bond creation, what we see is water breaks. So creation of ions, that is important here. Then what we have, oxidation. So remember, ferromagnesian minerals, they oxidize, they leads to rusting of those rocks. So that is what happens. And solution, as we know, that calcium and lime are soluble in water, so solution happens in certain areas. So these are all chemical weathering part. Then what we have is the biological weathering, that is the third type of weathering, and it is related to the decaying of rocks by organic matter. That's why it is biological. So here organic matter is important, and rock disintegration by plant or root growth, burrowing animals, tunneling organisms, acidic secretion, all these things are important in biological weathering. So basically floral activity or faunal activity. So burrowing animals and other organisms, when they die, they decompose, they secrete different kinds of acidic content. So that is important, that leads to this kind of reaction with the rock minerals, and it leads to disintegration of biological type. So that is what we study as types of weathering: mechanical, chemical and biological. So it is basically MCB. So you can remember that, right? Melbourne Cricket Board. After weathering, remember, there are certain products as well that we use. So if weathering would not happen, we would not get these products. What are the products of weathering then? So clay is one important thing, which is also known as hydrous aluminum silicate. So remember the process of hydration. So hydrous aluminum silicate is what we understand as clay, and remember, clay is used for so much of production of our utensils and so much of artifacts. Then sand is important, so sediment made of relatively coarse mineral grains. Then soil formation is important, grains of different sizes, and humus is again decayed organic matter that is present in the soil. So all these things are present, and they are helpful in terms of, if you say human cultures, they are products of weathering. That's how they are related. So here process geomorphology is related to what we study in human geography as well, because role of all these products are there in our everyday life. So now in today's session, when we have already learned about the first part of denudational process, that is the process of weathering, its various types, its characteristics, in the sessions to come, we are going to learn about the second part and the third part of this denudational process, in which we will be discussing about mass wasting, erosion, deposition and all other processes involved in this. So stay tuned, stay safe and all the best wishes.